Welcome back to the Deep Dive, where we sift through stacks of intense source material to give you the clearest path to understanding complex ideas.
And today, the task you've set for us is a big one.
It's a huge one. We are doing a rigorous, in-depth exploration of Louis Althusser,
Yeah.
the polarizing intellectual architect who really redefined how we understand power, ideology, and history itself.
He's not just another figure in 20th century thought. You have to see his work as a kind of strategic, almost emergency intervention.
Right.
We're diving into a very specific, very turbulent moment in the mid-20th century when the theoretical foundations of Western Marxism were just cracking.
And Althusser steps forward, operating from the École Normale Supérieure in Paris, with what he saw as a blueprint to save the entire project.
To save it from itself, in many ways.
Okay, so let's unpack this historical crisis because the political stakes here really define his entire body of work. We're talking about the years after 1953, Stalin's death, and especially 1956.
1956 is the absolute turning point. That's the year Nikita Khrushchev gets up and delivers the secret speech to the 20th Congress of the Soviet Communist Party.
And he just lays it all bare.
Everything. The extent of Stalin's purges, the political repression, the sheer horror of the gulags. For Western intellectuals, this was a catastrophic shockwave.
It had to be. It created a genuine crisis of faith.
Of course.
If the state that was built on the principles of historical materialism could produce this level of dogmatism and tyranny, what was wrong with the theory itself?
Exactly. And so intellectuals panicked. I mean, they really did. Many started searching for a way back to a more ethical, less rigid political philosophy.
They turned backward.
They turned backward, away from the rigidity of Stalinism, and they embraced the early, more philosophical writings of Marx.
The 1844 manuscripts.
Especially the 1844 manuscripts. They were looking for a softer, more humane Marxism, something rooted in ideas about a universal human essence and moral concerns. The humanist turn.
But Althusser, he's looking at this humanist retreat. And he doesn't see salvation at all.
He sees the exact opposite. He sees theoretical surrender.
A dangerous slide back into the very idealistic bourgeois notions that he thought Marx himself had already defeated.
Which is why his mission statement was so, paradoxical. He believed that the only way to politically revitalize Marxism, to make it a revolutionary force again, was to first purify it.
A theoretical cleanse.
The brutal one, stripping away all the Hegelian, sentimental, humanist influences. His goal was to reveal the true core of Marxism, which for him was a genuine objective science of history, historical materialism, something totally detached from what he saw as, moralistic chatter.
So that really sets the stage for a seriously complex thinker. We need to follow his evolution to really get a grip on this.
Absolutely. You have to do it chronologically.
We got the foundational classic structuralism of the 1960s, which is incredibly dense.
Then you have the self-critical, more political phase after the May '68 uprisings.
And finally, his late, fragmented, and really radical philosophical turn toward what he called aleatory materialism.
Or the materialism of the encounter.
Right. That structure is vital.
It is. We're tracing how he moves from trying to create this rigid, almost deterministic science to then embracing radical contingency and chance. And in doing that, he fundamentally redefines concepts like political agency, power, and the very idea of historical structure.
So our mission today is to provide you with the conceptual tools you'll need to navigate all three of those phases and see why his ideas are still so central to contemporary thought.
Let's get into it.
All right, let's start with that theoretical cleanup.
Yeah.
Because Althusser can't build his structural fortress until he demolishes the existing foundation. He launches this two-pronged attack against what he called the twin errors dominating Marxist theory in his time, economism and humanism.
And what's so interesting, as our sources point out, is that he saw these two, which seem like total opposites.
Right. One is dogmatic determinism. The other is all about human freedom.
Exactly. But he saw them as sharing a fundamental philosophical flaw.
An empiricist epistemology.
That is the key connection he makes. Empiricism, for him in this context, means the belief that knowledge comes directly from what you can see, from observable facts or from, lived experience.
And both of these tendencies, the dogmatic and the moralistic, believed the structure of society was sort of immediately visible, that it could be reduced to simple elements.
Precisely. Let's take the first target, economism and historicism. This was the official rigid dogma that was inherited from the Second International and then really solidified under Stalinism. It's built on a very mechanical view of society.
This is the base superstructure model that everyone learns about.
Right, the classic pyramid diagram. The base is the economic motor, the forces of production like technology and labor, and the relations of production like ownership.
And then the superstructure just sits passively on top of that.
Everything else, the law, the state, politics, ideology, all of it.
And the mechanical flaw, as Althusser saw it, was this idea of unilateral causality. The base causes everything.
Precisely. In that standard economistic reading, the base is the one and only active ultimate cause. Everything in the superstructure is just a passive reflection, a shadow of the economic reality.
So if the economy changes, the law and ideology just automatically update to match it.
Yes. And this reduces the entire history of social formations to what he called techno-economist determinism.
Which is politically disastrous.
Utterly.
Because if the economy automatically determines everything, why would you bother with political struggle or intellectual critique or revolution? History just becomes this linear, pre-programmed path.
Feudalism must become capitalism, which must become socialism. It's inevitable.
And Althusser just fiercely rejected this.
He saw it as a kind of theoretical laziness, really, a form of bourgeois evolutionism just dressed up in Marxist language. It completely strips politics of its efficacy, of its contingency. His entire project in this early structuralist phase was about creating a new way to think about causality that could preserve the primacy of the economy without falling into this mechanical trap.
Okay, so that's target one. Target the humanist movement seems like a total rejection of that determinism.
It does.
But he condemns it just as fiercely. So why was this search for a universal human essence just as dangerous as economic determinism?
This is his critique of Marxist humanism, which was championed by figures who wanted to, retrieve Marx's soul. They argued that the fundamental concept in Marxism was alienation.
The separation of the individual, of man, from his universal potential, his species being.
And therefore, communism becomes this ethical project of disalienation, reconciling man with himself.
It sounds ethically inspiring, sure, but Althusser just dismisses it as a theoretical catastrophe.
He does.
Why? Because it puts the concept of man at the center of history.
That's the absolute core of the problem for him. Any concept rooted in human essence or the subject or alienation is, for Althusser, pre-scientific. It's ideological.
It's baggage from Hegel and Feuerbach.
It's inherited straight from 19th century bourgeois philosophy. A science of history cannot begin with an abstract universal category like man. It's a concept that just dissolves the concrete reality of class struggle, of social relations, into this kind of misty, sentimental unity.
It's like trying to build modern chemistry using the concepts of alchemy.
Perfect analogy.
You have to completely purge the language to get to the actual science.
Exactly. If your starting point is man, you can only ever end up with a moral critique. Capitalism is bad because it harms man. You can't get to a scientific analysis of its structure, which is that capitalism is defined by the extraction of surplus value regardless of how man feels about it.
And this political necessity, the need to purge man from the theory, that leads him directly to his famous strategic weapon.
The epistemological break, or the coupure epistémologique,
which he borrows from French philosophers of science.
Right, people like Gaston Bachelard and Georges Cangelhem, their whole argument is that true science doesn't just improve on old ideas. It emerges through a dramatic rupture with the ideological common sense that came before it.
And Althusser's radical move was to apply this to Marx himself. He says there's a fundamental rupture right in the middle of Marx's own intellectual development. He locates it around 1845.
It creates a clear dividing line. You have the before, which is the young Marx, the one writing the 1844 manuscripts, engaging in philosophical commentary, still trapped in Hegelian humanism, and offering a moral critique.
And then you have the after 1845, particularly with the German ideology.
This is the scientific turn. He argues Marx stops talking about universal man and starts building a completely new, objective, materialist conceptual apparatus.
Forces of production, relations of production, mode of production, surplus value.
He's building the science of history.
Now, this periodization is intensely debated by historians.
Oh, massively.
But for Althusser, it was a brilliant strategic move. By locating the break there, he could just dismiss the humanists' favorite texts, the 1844 manuscripts, as being pre-Marxist, as ideological.
It's an act of intellectual warfare. He's hardening the theoretical definition of Marxism to make it resistant to what he sees as contamination by bourgeois idealism.
You can see why it was so controversial.
Yep.
He's essentially saying, if you want to be a Marxist, You can't read Marx for what he intended to say. You have to read him for the scientific structure he unintentionally built.
Exactly, and that moves us directly into his methodology.
So now that the theoretical field is cleared, Althusser presents the tools we need to actually read this science of history.
Right, to read the structure itself, which means we have to move far beyond simple empiricism.
And this begins with his reading method, which is a real conceptual breakthrough. Symptomatic reading, or lecture symptomale. We're normally trained to read a text for what the author is explicitly saying, what they intend. Althusser tells us to do the complete opposite.
He treats a text, whether it's Das Kapital or just a political pamphlet, not as a transparent window into the author's mind, but as a material product, as a struggle.
And the truth isn't in what's said, the manifest content, but in the symptoms.
Exactly. The gaps, the silences, the contradictions, the unstated assumptions, the questions the author fails to ask. These symptoms reveal the presence of a new, emerging scientific problem that the author themselves isn't fully equipped to articulate yet.
So the focus shifts completely, away from the author's consciousness and onto the underlying structure that dictates what can and cannot be thought at that time.
This is where the concept of the problematique, becomes so critical.
So the problematic is what exactly? The set of assumptions.
It's more than that. It's the entire conceptual framework, the matrix of thought, that governs a theoretical field. It predetermines the very possibility of knowledge by defining what the legitimate objects of inquiry even are.
Let's go back to our earlier example. The humanist problematic starts with the isolated, free individual. So within that framework, it's literally impossible to think of class struggle as an objective structural force that exists independently of what individuals want.
Exactly. The humanist problematic makes the structure disappear. Conversely, the Marxist problematic starts with the complex relations of production.
And in that framework, the individual subject is immediately just a structural position, a bearer of objective functions.
A worker, an owner, a manager. It can no longer be the philosophical starting point. The question is no longer what does man want, but what is the function of this position in the structure?
So if you shift the problematic, you fundamentally change the questions you can even ask. And Althusser argues that this intellectual labor shifting the problematic is itself a form of labor. He calls it theoretical practice.
He was insistent on this. Philosophy is not just contemplation or interpretation. It's a productive activity. It's labor that you perform on concepts to produce knowledge. And he formalized this with a famous transformation model involving 3 stages, or generalities.
Okay, so you start with generalities.
That's your raw material, your input. It's the vague, ideological, pre-scientific notions, the empirical data, the common sense ideas that often just cloud our understanding.
Then you apply the tools, generalities too.
Those are your theoretical means of production. This is the scientific method, the new conceptual apparatus like surplus value or mode of production. These are the intellectual machines you use to process the raw data.
And the output, the finished product, is generalities 3.
Which is the concrete, objective knowledge, the truth produced by the theoretical practice. It's a conceptual structure that represents the real conditions of existence, but purified of all that ideological fog.
I could definitely appreciate the rigor he's aiming for.
Yeah.
But I can also see the critique that came later, the charge of theoreticism.
Oh, absolutely.
If knowledge is produced purely by working on concepts, doesn't that make the theorist into a kind of priestly elite, totally detached from the messy reality of political struggle or what workers are actually experiencing?
That criticism is completely fair, and it's something Althusser himself had to grapple with later. But in the 1960s, this was his defense. It was his way of asserting the scientific status of the theory against people who demanded that it just be subservient to immediate political demands or, party dogma. He had to be rigid.
That rigidity in method was definitely matched by a total renovation of how history operates. So if he rejects the simplistic cause and effect of the base superstructure model, what does he replace it with?
He needed a model of causality that could account for complexity without just abandoning the idea that the economy is ultimately determinate.
So he starts by rejecting the 2 dominant models of causality in Western philosophy.
First, he gets rid of transitive causality, the kind we associate with Descartes or Newton. Simple, linear, A causes B, which causes C. The social formation is just far too complex for that kind of model.
And the second one he rejects is expressive causality, which is associated with Hegel.
That's the idealist trap. Expressive causality says that the essential spirit, the zeitgeist, expresses itself in every single part of society. So art, law, the economy, they're all just variations on the same spiritual theme.
It's reductionist.
Totally reductionist. It assumes this simple, total unity, and it completely ignores the specific different histories of, say, law or religion.
Okay, so he throws those out and turns to Spinoza to develop structural causality. And this is where the structure, the economic reality, is an absent cause. That term absent cause it's incredibly abstract. Can you make that more tangible for us?
Okay, let's try. Think of a game of chess. The rules of chess, that's the structure. They aren't physically present on the board. You can't point to the rules as an object. Yet the rules are the absolute cause of every single move, every strategy, every possibility within that game. The structure is immanent in its effects. It exists only in the relations between the parts, the specific position of the pieces, the possible moves, the way they all interact.
So the economy functions like the rules of chess for society. It determines the general arrangement, who's a pawn, who's a knight, but it doesn't move the individual pieces directly.
Precisely. The structure isn't something acting from the outside. It's the internal configuration that determines the nature and function of all the elements within it.
And this leads us to his concept for how historical change actually happens. Overdetermination.
Surdeterminé. He borrows this straight from Freudian dream analysis.
Where a single dream image, a symptom, is never caused by just one simple event.
Never. It's always a condensation of multiple, layered, often contradictory, unconscious desires and memories.
So when he applies this to history, it means that a crisis or a historical contradiction is never pure. It's never just one thing.
It's always overdetermined. It's a complex condensation of multiple, totally heterogeneous contradictions. You have economic ones, political ones, ideological, religious, even international relations. They all just pile up on top of one another.
His key case study for this is the Russian Revolution in 1917. If history was just a linear mechanical process, the revolution should have happened in the most advanced capitalist nation, like Germany. Instead, it happens in Russia, the weakest link.
And the structuralist explanation is that in Russia, you had 5 or more distinct contradictions, all condensed into a single localized crisis. It created what he calls a ruptural unity.
So you had the core economic contradiction, bourgeoisie versus proletariat.
But that was overdetermined by the unresolved feudal tensions between the aristocracy and the peasantry.
Plus the political pressure of this massive, repressive czarist bureaucracy.
Plus the severe military pressures of the imperialist war and the ideological weaknesses of the church and the military. They all fused together.
So the event wasn't inevitable. It wasn't some pure Hegelian expression of a single essence. It was the result of a contingent, specific pileup of weaknesses at a certain moment in time.
Exactly. And this is where political struggle re-enters the picture, because you need agents who can seize that moment of rupture.
Which brings us to the famous theoretical balancing act. How does he square all this complexity with the Marxist idea that the economy is still primary?
He keeps the concept of determination in the last instance by the economy, but he couples it with the idea of relative autonomy for the superstructure.
Okay, so relative autonomy means the non-economic parts, law, ideology, the state, they aren't just puppets.
Not at all. They have their own structural logic, their own histories, their own rhythms, and that allows them to have what he calls specific effectivity. Meaning, for instance, a state's political or military structure can significantly speed up or, conversely, block economic development, even if the economy remains the ultimate foundation.
So the economy is only determined in the last instance, but that instance defines the overall arrangement.
Yes. So in feudalism, the economic structure required that religion and kinship be the dominant spheres for its own reproduction. The economy determined that religion would be dominant.
Whereas in capitalism, the economy determines that the economic sphere itself has to be structurally dominant.
But, and this is the crucial caveat, the line that defined this whole theoretical turn, it's Althusser's famous qualification.
The lonely hour of the last instance never comes.
What a brilliant line. It means the economy never shows up in its pure form, unmediated, to sweep everything else away. It's always entangled. It's always overdetermined by political and ideological and historical pressures. The economic foundation is the ultimate determinant, but the reality we live in is always the complex interplay of the whole structure.
Okay, so with this complex, overdetermined structure of the social world established, Althusser then moves to address what is, it's arguably his most influential contribution.
I think it is.
How that structure actually reproduces itself. which leads to his monumental 1970 essay, Ideology and Ideological State Apparatuses.
The core question he's trying to solve here is a practical one. Classical Marxism really focused on the state as a repressive force. Police, prisons, the army, that was necessary to maintain class domination.
And Althusser accepts that, but he sees a gap.
A huge gap. If coercion were the only method, society would just be in a perpetual state of civil war. So how does a capitalist society ensure the reproduction of the conditions of production?
And by that he means not just the technical skills of the workers,
but their willingness to submit to the system. How does that happen without constant violence?
He realized the state apparatus was much bigger and more diffuse than just the police station.
And he draws this sharp theoretical distinction between two types of state power. They both serve the ruling class, but they operate through very different primary modes.
First up, the repressive state apparatus, RSA.
The RSA functions primarily by violence, or at least the threat of violence, physical, administrative, judicial. It's unified, it's centralized, and it's public. The army, the police, the courts, the prisons, the core government. It's the necessary backdrop of force.
And then second, the really revolutionary concept.
Yeah.
The ideological state apparatuses, ISAs.
The ISAs function primarily by ideology, by consent, by camouflage, by ritual. They're plural, they're relatively autonomous, they're decentralized, and often they appear to be private entities. That's what masks their connection to state power.
You're talking about the family, the educational system, the media, the church, political parties.
All of them.
I think the ISA concept was so explosive because it redefined these seemingly benign institutions that we take for granted. The school, the church, as part of the machinery of state power.
Absolutely. And Althusser argued that in mature, late capitalism, the educational ISA, so the school, has become the dominant apparatus. It's taken over the role the church played in feudal society.
And what does the school do? Well, it captures children from a young age for years and years, and during that time they're inculcated with a massive dose of ideology, all under the guise of learning.
It serves two essential functions. First, it teaches the necessary skills, the know-how that the workforce needs. But second, and crucially, it teaches the rules of good behavior, all wrapped in the ruling ideology.
Submission to authority, respect for the hierarchy, the necessity of competition, the virtue of hard work.
And it sorts them. It filters individuals into the structural positions needed by the economy. Some become specialized workers, some technicians, some managers, and some become ideologues themselves.
And the brilliance of the ISA is that this coercive training is camouflaged. It's presented as education or family values, so the submission feels like it's voluntary consent. The coercion is masked by belief.
And that insight forces us to look very closely at the other linchpin of this whole section, his radical redefinition of ideology.
Right, he rejects the old idea of ideology as just false consciousness, like a simple mental error or an illusion that a person can just consciously shake off.
If it's not just a mistake in your head, what is it?
His definition is complex, but it's so vital. Ideology is a representation of the imaginary relationship of individuals to their real conditions of existence.
So it's not necessarily false, but it's the structure through which we live our objective reality. And crucially, it lets us imagine ourselves as free and unified subjects, even as we're living in conditions of class exploitation.
Which leads to this idea of the materiality of ideology. If it's not a mental error, where does it exist?
It exists in the apparatuses and in their associated practices and rituals. Ideology is material because it's instantiated in concrete structures and actions. The belief doesn't come before the action. The action produces the belief.
The famous analogy he uses here, the one that really grounds this abstract concept, is Pascal's formula.
Yes, Pascal advised the non-believer, kneel down, move your lips in prayer, and you will believe.
The point being sociological and materialist.
Exactly. The material practice, the ritual of physically kneeling, of going through the motions, that's what produces the subject's inner sense of belief and submission. By showing up to work, by driving on the right side of the road, by filling out tax forms, we are enacting the material practices that constantly reinforce the ideological structure of the state.
This is such a profound shift. The subject doesn't choose the ideology. The apparatuses and their rituals construct the subject.
Which leads us to the core mechanism, interpellation or hailing. How does ideology actually recruit us into these roles?
Interpellation is the act by which ideology constitutes individuals as subjects. And Althusser uses that famous metaphor of the police officer shouting to a pedestrian on the street.
Hey, you there?
So first, there's the hail, the call issued from the apparatus, the law, the state.
Second, the pedestrian turns 180 degrees. And this turn is the crucial moment of recognition. By turning, the individual recognizes that the call was meant for them specifically, and in that one instant, they are constituted as the subject who obeys the law.
And Althusser's point is that this process ensures we are always already subjects. Before we're even born, we're interpolated into the family ISA. We're given a name, a gender, we're assigned a place in the existing ideological structure.
We are constantly being hailed, constantly recognizing ourselves. And this is where the paradox of the word subject becomes so clear, because it carries two totally antagonistic meanings at the same time.
The first meaning is the familiar one. The free, autonomous subject, the sovereign agent, the author of their own actions.
But the second meaning is the historically older one, the subjected being. One who is subservient to a higher power, like a subject of the crown or a subjected citizen of the state.
And Althusser argues that ideology creates the illusion of the first meaning, the belief that I am free, I choose my own path.
Specifically to ensure the reality of the second, subjection to the ideological structure. As he puts it, the subject works by himself because he believes he's free.
That's the ultimate twist. The freedom we feel is the very mechanism of our submission, the very tight, very powerful theory.
But the rigid structuralism of the 1960s, as theoretically powerful as it was, it couldn't survive contact with political reality.
Right. The massive May 1968 student and worker uprisings in France, which nearly toppled the government, they fundamentally challenged Althusser's entire system.
And the biggest shock for Althusser was the role of the French Communist Party, the PCF, which he was a member of. The PCF largely failed to lead the movement. They didn't even grasp its revolutionary potential. They just saw it as, student adventurism.
And this political failure forces him to reassess his own distance from political action.
The criticism that was being directed at him was that his theory, often called theoreticism, was just too intellectual, too detached. It was too focused on producing pure knowledge rather than dealing with the immediate necessities of class struggle.
So he responds in 1974 with his essays in self-criticism, and he admits his earlier work was too rigid in that science versus ideology distinction.
He realized that science is never purely detached. It's always intertwined with the political field.
And he fundamentally redefines what philosophy is. His old definition was that philosophy is a theory of theoretical practice focused on truth and knowledge.
But his new definition is overtly militant, overtly political. Philosophy is class struggle in theory.
That is a massive philosophical shift. It means philosophy doesn't have its own distinct objects anymore. It doesn't discover facts about history or physics. Its function is purely practical.
Its function is to draw demarcation lines.
Right.
Its purpose is to intervene politically to distinguish between the genuinely scientific materialist concepts that the working class needs, like mode of production, and the ideological bourgeois concepts that threaten to infect the labor movement.
Like man or freedom of choice.
Exactly. Philosophy becomes a weapon, a political instrument of intervention within the theoretical domain.
And this was perfectly illustrated by his polemic against the British communist John Lewis, who was pushing the humanist line that man makes history.
For Althusser, this debate wasn't academic at all, it was existential. Lewis's humanism was the theoretical justification for reformism, for compromise. Althusser countered with the materialist, uncompromising position. The masses make history.
The agent of change isn't the abstract universal subject man, it's the masses organized through class struggle.
And focusing on man simply serves to ideologically mask the reality of exploitation.
But even after this self-criticism, Althusser was not done evolving. In his final, fragmented, often haunting works, written after a breakdown and during intense political isolation, he pushed his rejection of determinism to the absolute extreme.
This is where he articulates his concept of aleatory materialism.
It's a profound, late turn. He identifies this hidden philosophical tradition, an underground current, that he says has been actively repressed by the dominant idealist traditions of necessity. Plato, Aristotle, Hegel.
And this current includes figures like Epicurus, Machiavelli, Spinoza, Hobbes, all of them united by their rejection of two core tenets of classical thought.
Teleology, the idea that history has an inherent goal or purpose.
And necessity, the idea that history follows inevitable laws.
So he turns to the most radical form of ancient atomism to make his point, the Epicurean metaphor of the reign of atoms.
Imagine the universe as the void, the state of non-relationship, of non-structure. Atoms are just falling parallel in this void, unable to interact with each other. If that's the end of the story, nothing ever gets created. No world could ever exist.
But something has to cause that first interaction.
That's the Klineman, The Kleneman is a microscopic, utterly random, spontaneous swerve of the first atom. This unpredictable deviation causes it to collide with a neighboring atom, and that initiates a chain reaction, a pileup.
That results in the formation of a stable structure, the world.
So the structure, the world, is founded on pure contingency, on a fluke.
This completely upends the traditional view of history.
Completely. For Althusser, contingency is primary. Necessity is only secondary. And when you apply this to history, the entire mode of production, capitalism, feudalism, it's not a necessary outcome of anything. It's a contingent encounter, a rencontre.
Okay, so give us the contingent encounter that defines capitalism.
It's the encounter between the man with money, the person who owns the means of production, and the man with nothing but labor power. These are two historically separate elements that could have easily just missed each other. Their meeting was not guaranteed by any law of history.
But when they did meet, when that chance collision happened.
The structure of capitalism was able to form.
And so how does necessity come back into the picture?
Once the structure forms, once the encounter is successful, it has to take hold, prize. If it takes hold, it then creates stability and it reproduces itself through its own internal laws. That's necessity. But we must always remember that this stability, this necessity, rests on a foundational contingency, a random swerve in the void.
This radical turn really completed his dismantling of any deterministic reading of Marx. It's a process without a subject and critically.
A process without a goal. There is no guaranteed socialist future. The historical field is just a perpetual void of possibilities.
Which makes the role of the political agent, Machiavelli's prince, to seize that moment of vulnerability and try to force a new productive encounter that might just take hold.
Given the sheer density and the political provocation of his theories, it's just astonishing how deeply Althusser's work shaped the next generation of thought.
It really is. His concepts provided the vocabulary that was necessary to move beyond the limitations of classical Marxism and start to address culture, race, and sexuality.
This structural inheritance, it defines so much of post-structuralism and critical theory.
Let's start with Stuart Hall and the Birmingham School of Cultural Studies, who adapted Althusserianism to the British context.
Hall and his colleagues were facing a real problem. How do you analyze British society without falling into that vulgar reductionism that sees every cultural phenomenon, music, style, media, as just a simple, direct reflection of the economic class struggle? They needed more complexity.
So Hall takes Althusser's concept of overdetermination and transforms it into articulation.
Articulation is the idea that the links between different elements of society, like economic class, political affiliation, racial identity, they're not fixed. They're not inevitable. They have to be actively, contingently joined together like a knee joint. They're temporary strategic connections that can be broken and then rejoined in new ways.
And this solved their reductionism problem.
Yeah.
It allowed them to analyze political phenomena like Thatcherism.
Exactly. The rise of Margaret Thatcher saw so many working-class people voting against their traditional economic interests.
And the explanation was that Thatcherism succeeded by skillfully articulating free market economics, the base, with these powerful traditionalist, nationalist, and patriarchal ideologies, the superstructure.
It reconfigured what was considered common sense. The links between class position and political ideology had to be actively forged. They weren't automatic.
And this framework also allowed Hall to make that critical intervention into race and class, arguing powerfully that race is the modality in which class is lived.
Meaning, the ideological structure of race is not just some secondary side effect of economic exploitation. It's a material force. It's a highly effective mechanism in the ISA of society that overdetermines and shapes exactly how a person experiences their class position. It divides the working class and creates very specific forms of oppression.
Okay, so moving from ideology to power, we have to talk about Michel Foucault, who was a former student of Althusser's.
We do.
Foucault famously rejected the term ideology, yet his work is arguably unthinkable without the ISA concept.
Foucault found the term ideology problematic because for Althusser, ideology always implies that there's a truth science that can expose it. And Foucault rejected any claim to a universal truth, so he replaced ideology with concepts like discourse and power knowledge.
But his entire analysis of prisons, schools, hospitals, clinics, his concept of disciplinary power and the microphysics of power.
It is structurally indebted to the ISA. The continuity is the focus on materiality. Where Althusser saw the subject being formed through ideological belief and interpolation, The police officers Hale Foucault saw the subject being formed through bodily training, spatial discipline, and routine.
So the Althusserian insight that ideology is material and exists in institutions, not just in the mind.
It completely paved the way for Foucault's detailed historical analysis of how power operates minute by minute through the organization of space and time.
And we see the thread of interpolation continued so powerfully in gender and queer theory, particularly with Judith Butler.
Yes, who revisited that police officer scene in The Psychic Life of Power.
Butler pointed out that Althusser left a burning question unanswered.
Why the immediate turn? Why that instantaneous recognition and submission to the Hale? Althusser just says we're always already subjects, but Butler asks about the psychic mechanism of that prior formation.
She merges Althusser with Freudian concepts to argue that we are formed in and through subordination.
We are passionately attached to the norms of gender, sexuality, and society, the very things that subordinate us, because conforming to those norms is the only way we can exist as recognizable, viable social subjects.
So we perform gender norms, which are material practices, because we are psychically invested in our own subjection. It's the condition of possibility for our existence.
Butler argues the very emergence of the subject is an act of subordination. It's a powerful and tragic reading that completely reorients Althusser's political insight into the realm of the psyche.
Okay, finally, let's turn to the internal critiques. The brilliant thinkers who came out of the Althusserian universe but then launched direct attacks on its limitations, specifically Jacques Rancière and Alain Badiou.
Rancière's critique was profoundly political. He was just incensed by the hierarchy he saw as being inherent in that science versus ideology distinction. In his 1974 work, Althusser's Lesson, he attacked the whole system as a form of intellectual policing.
Policing? Why police?
Because the theory establishes a hierarchy where the theorist, or the party elite, holds the scientific knowledge generalities the third, and then must educate the masses, who are supposedly trapped in the illusions of ideology generalities third.
And Rancière argued this just justifies the domination of the intellectual over the worker.
He argued instead for the equality of intelligences. And he suggested that politics truly begins when the masses disrupt the established order without needing a theorist to scientifically validate their actions. Politics is the interruption of the order, not the application of a scientific truth.
And then there's Alain Badiou, who embraced Althusser's rigor and anti-humanism, but just found the process without a subject unacceptable.
Badiou accepted the premise of the aleatory encounter, but he needed to reintroduce a radical concept of the subject.
So he formalizes the contingent encounter into the event.
A sudden, unpredictable rupture like May 68 or a scientific discovery that cannot be explained by the surrounding structure. But crucially, for Badiou, the subject is reborn against the structure. The subject is defined by its fidelity, its commitment to the event, to the truth that was declared in that momentary rupture. The subject is not a support of the structure, as Althusser had it, but a militant force that emerges from the void to maintain the truth of that chance occurrence.
Wow, what a dense and truly transformative body of work. We started with Louis Althusser trying to perform a kind of theoretical triage to save Marxism from the crisis of Stalinism and the retreat of humanism.
And his central achievement was the creation of a structural science of history, armed with tools like the epistemological break to purge idealism, structural causality, and overdetermination to map complexity.
And the ideological state apparatuses to analyze the invisible architecture of power reproduction.
His legacy isn't a completed system, it's really a toolbox. He gave contemporary theory the concepts it needed to analyze the dense, nonlinear nature of historical change.
And crucially, to understand that power resides not just in overt repression, but in the material routines and institutions that shape us into who we are supposed to be.
He fundamentally changed the relationship between structure and agency, and in doing so, he set the entire horizon for decades of critical thought. He forced us to ask, if history is not necessary, what then is the purpose of political action?
So here is the provocative thought we'll leave you with, something to mull over. Althusser spent his most rigorous years trying to demonstrate that history operates as a process without a subject, and that human consciousness is fundamentally an effective structure. The profound, beautiful irony of his philosophy is that this very realization that the system operates without us at the center provided the theoretical leverage for the next generation of thinkers, from Hall to Butler to Badiou, to devise entirely new ways to assert political and intellectual subjectivity in a world defined by contingency.